This episode of Diffusion was originally broadcast on the 4th of October in 2010.
Diffusion, the international science radio show.
We have a bouncer on the doors of perception.
The good, the bad, the ugly.
It gets pretty exciting.
The myths, the truths.
Toxicology.
Astroseismology.
Magnetism. The dark side.
Genetically engineered potatoes.
Planetoid.
Planetoid.
I love that word.
Hello and welcome to Diffusion. Listen to amazing and bizarre science infused throughout your brain. I'm Ian Woolf, and on this edition we'll feature godlike, massive, super-intelligent machines and plankton. The Singularity Summit Australia is a meeting where scientists, engineers and philosophers can cast their imagination forwards to speculate about things to come. Hugo De Garis started life as a theoretical physicist, but moved into artificial intelligence. He's designed artificial brains with evolvable hardware. His artificial brains use genetic algorithms to evolve neural networks using three-dimensional cellular automata inside field-programmable gate arrays. He owns a lot of patents. At the Singularity Summit in Melbourne, Hugo De Garis spoke to me about the subject of his first book, The Artilect War, Cosmists versus Terrans, a bit of controversy concerning whether humanity should build godlike, massively intelligent machines. His last project was running the Artificial Brain Lab for Xiamen University in China.
No, I'm retired, but a few months back, I was director of the Artificial Brain Lab at Xiamen University in China. I was building China's first artificial brain, basically evolving neural networks very fast in the latest hardware, and putting tens of thousands of them together to make artificial brains to control robots to do interesting things. 5 years ago, I wrote a book called The Artilect War. I need to explain what an Artilect is. It's short for artificial intellect, and it's a future godlike, massively intelligent machine. And if you look at the physics of computation, you can come to the conclusion these machines, eventually, in future decades this century, could have capacities literally trillions of times above the human level.
Now, I understand superintelligent. Can you explain a bit more why it's godlike in superintelligence?
Well, just as the sheer numbers. I mean, for example, it would think like 1,000,000 times faster than we would, because it'd be thinking at electronic speeds, like our computers, whereas our human brains, we think at chemical speeds, which is like, maximum 100 meters a second. Whereas electronic speeds, it's the speed of light, which is 1,000,000 times faster. So they could have virtually unlimited memory. They could redesign themselves. They could perform experiments on parts of themselves, evolutionary type experiments, look at the results, and if they were superior to the rest of them, then they could then incorporate that superiority into themselves and restructure themselves, and all this at the speed of light, right? So these creatures would be absolutely incredible, amazing. So given that the technologies that are coming this century, I believe, I'm almost certain, so humanity then is faced with an enormous political, ethical question. Do we as a human species, do we want to become number two? Do we allow these machines to dominate us? Some people say, well, how about human beings themselves become these godlike creatures, these artilects, as I call them. So you can imagine people adding components to their heads and becoming artilects themselves, and that's certainly an option. A lot of people will do that. The thing is that the computing capacity, even of a grain of sugar, is so fantastically superior to that of a human brain, that very quickly any cyborg, there's another new word, cybernetic organism. In other words, part machine, part human.
Yes.
So these cyborgs effectively would just become artilects. Probably the scenario I see as the most realistic. What's going to unfold is that 10 years from now, a lot of us will have home robots controlled by artificial brains. I mean, today, the research field of artificial brains is booming. Moore's law says that the number of transistors you can cram onto a chip keeps doubling every year and a half or so. And that trend has been true for about 45 years, and it's likely to be true for another 10 years or more. So by around 2020, you'll be putting a single bit of information on one atom. So then you start asking yourself, well, if I hold an apple in my hand, how many atoms is that? So how many bits if it were suitably processed? Well, the answer is about 1 trillion. And then you ask, well, how quickly could these atoms flip from a 0 to 1? And the answer is about a femtosecond. Well, what's that? Well, let's say roughly it's a thousandth of a trillionth of a second. So imagine then you had this apple and it's been processed so that every bit's behaving like a little computer, like an atom, a bit switcher, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, and very, very fast. So the bit processing capacity of that apple is 1 trillion, that's the number of atoms, times the number of times it can flip back and forth in a second. Well, that's sort of a femtosecond. So you do the math, and you end up with a huge figure like 10 to the power 40, roughly. Now, if you ask a similar question, well, what about the human brain? What's its processing rate? Well, there's roughly 100 billion neurons, that's brain cells, in the brain. Each one of those roughly connects to about 10,000 others. And each connection, the connection is called a synapse in brain science. So each synapse can communicate roughly about 10 bits per second maximum. So you do that math, and you end up with something like 10 to the power 16. Now remember those two numbers. Before, the apple was 10 to the 40, and the human brain's about 10 to the power 16. That's a difference of 10 to the 24. That's 1 trillion. So in other words, what we're saying is the technology of the near future, the next few decades, potentially could create creatures that have computational capacities 1 trillion times superior to the human brain. Now you may say, well, that's not artificial intelligence, that's just massive bit processing rates. And of course, that's true. So remember those two numbers. So the bit processing rate of the human brain is about 10 to the power 16, and the apple was about 10 to the power 40. Yes. So that's a difference of 10 to the power 24. That's 1 trillion, or if you like, 1 million times superior. Now, having a device that can flip bits very fast, that's not massive intelligence. So how do you get massive intelligence? Well, there are various ways, but probably the common sense way is simply to copy the brain. I mean our brain, our human brain. So neuroscience is jumping ahead in leaps and bounds. So every month there are major discoveries on how the brain functions. And because of Moore's law, all these new electronics create new tools for investigating the brain. So it sort of feeds back on each other. So more and more neuroscience guys can give their ideas to the neuroengineering people. So eventually the two fields will virtually wed. So sort of like practical physics and theoretical physics. They're virtually one subject. Didn't been that way for a while. So neuroscience and neuroengineering will become one. And then you'll get increasingly brain-like computers. Now, for example, IBM in New York is heavily into this now. They talk about cognitive computing, right? Because they see this huge market coming. The Korean government is quasi-promising its population that by about 2020, the government wants to put a home robot in every Korean household. And of course these home robots would be controlled by artificial brains, brain-like machines. And they would be genuinely useful, increasingly intelligent. And Bill Gates, everyone knows, he's on record saying by the year more or less 2030, the home robot industry, controlled by artificial brains, will be one of the biggest and richest industries in the world. And the reason for that is, ask yourself, how much would you individually be prepared to pay for a genuinely useful, intelligent home robot that could walk the dog and wash the dishes and clean the house and wash the clothes? And people would be prepared to pay big money, more money than for a car. So obviously a huge industry. Okay, next step. So imagine, jump ahead 10, 15, whatever years, and imagine now that you get a call from your friend, the next door neighbour, who says, "Hey, come over and look at my latest home robot." So you go next door and you're very impressed, and the robot starts joking with you, and its vocabulary is like 3 times richer than the previous model, and so on and so forth. So you're very impressed, so you too go out and ditch your old model and buy a new one. Now, after doing this a few times, you and a billion other people on the planet are noticing that the so-called IQ gap, the difference between human-level intelligence and these artificial brain-based home robots, their level of intelligence, that gap is closing. It's getting smaller and smaller. So people then start, millions of people start asking the obvious questions. Well, are we going to let these machines become as intelligent as human beings? Is that a good thing? Could they become more intelligent than we are? Is that a good thing? I mean, could we stop it? Should we stop it? Big, major questions like this. And so in time, I see this, I call it the species dominance issue. I see this issue dominating our global politics this century.
More of Hugo De Garis a little later in the show. You're listening to Ian Woolf on Diffusion Science Radio. Send emails to science@diffusionradio.com. We're brought to you across Australia on the Community Radio Network and podcast over the internet on www.diffusionradio.com. Next up, Lachlan Whatmore. They say the sea was once a soup that gave birth to life. Well, guess what? It still is. The ocean surface waters are basically an aqueous solution of life, in more ways than one.
When I was young and stupid, I was charged with collecting some seaweeds for a certain school I was working for, so that the kids would know the difference between chlorophytes, firefights and rhodophytes, known more commonly as green algae, brown algae and red algae respectively. No worries, I thought, and repaired to my local rock platform, where I happily tore specimens of seaweed from the rock, with the thought of being arrested for not having a collection permit the last thing on my mind. Now, these things will need some seawater to sit in, I said to myself, and filled up 2 20-litre reservoirs with the stuff. Back at the lab, I set up the 3 exhibits in broad, shallow glass dishes, each containing about 15 litres of now slightly less than fresh seawater, with a presentation style worthy of a museum, the specimens nicely lit with those cheap little lamps from the Education Department supply depot, and some neatly written information cards for years 11 and 12 to learn about algae. That was on a Saturday morning. And of course, come Monday, the whole place smelled like one of those piles of kelp that's been pushed up past the high tide mark and left to rot for a month. Seawater is of course just like blood. It's full of living cells, and when those cells are taken out of their normal, nourishing environment, they die, and thus stink. I was very lucky not to get fired. To call seawater the blood of the earth, or at least of her biosphere, isn't as romantic as it sounds. Where blood has red cells, white cells, immigrant bacteria, and the occasional metabolite of something a little bit naughty, seawater is the home of zooplankton, phytoplankton, marine bacteria, marine viruses, marine funguses, the occasional slick of oil from naughty people, and a whole lot more. Plankton are marine organisms that drift with surface currents with little to no control over where they go. Every cubic centimetre of seawater contains millions of organisms. Most marine invertebrates, such as crabs, corals and crinoids, spend their larval phase in the plankton. So do many species of fish, whose eggs mature in the ocean currents, the same place where krill bloom in the millions and keep the humpback visitors to the Australian east coast fat and happy. The plankton community is a world all by itself, living and growing and being eaten in equal massive measure, covering 7/10 of the planet's surface to a depth which is variable, depending on conditions. The foundation of the plankton, the source of primary production, and half of the oxygen produced on the Earth is the phytoplankton. Let me repeat that. Half the oxygen produced on this planet is made by phytoplankton. The phytoplankton are defined as the autotrophic component of the planktonic community. What this means is that they make their own food, usually by photosynthesis, and don't graze or prey on some other poor bugger. This noble, selfless and indescribably important group doesn't just include plants but also the cyanobacteria, more commonly called blue-green algae, which is neither a plant nor a bacterium, the diatoms, which we can't decide are plants or should be put into their own kingdom, and the dinoflagellates, which are definitely plants, we think. Here's the scary part. Phytoplankton is under serious threat. A team led by PhD student Daniel Boyce from Dalhousie University in Canada has analysed decades of data recording and has concluded that phytoplankton levels have dropped worldwide by 40% since 1950. The precise reasons for this are unclear. One model suggests the increased stratification of the water column, which isolates a warm surface layer above a cold deep one and doesn't allow much mixing across the boundary or thermocline between them. Phytoplankton, like all life, need nutrients, especially minerals such as nitrates and iron. These nutrients are found in abundance in deep cold water, which enriches the upper water column in mixing events called upwelling. However, the lack of mixing leaves the phytoplankton with a nice warm sunlit habitat, but without a thing to eat. I should say at this point that these data are very general, and some areas, for example the Indian Ocean, buck the trend and show a phytoplankton increase. However, given the importance of phytoplankton as Mother Earth's green blood cells, it's about time some more attention was paid to this vital component to life on Earth. So stay tuned. In the weeks to come, I'm going to present some family portraits of the phytoplankton tribe.
Lachlan Whatmore reports from his favourite place in the whole wide, beautiful world, and the crisis facing phytoplankton. Hugo De Garis has published 2 books this year, Multis and Monos, What the Multicultured Can Teach the Monocultured Toward the Creation of a Global State. And also, Artificial Brains, an Evolved Neural Net Module Approach.
Once millions and probably even billions of people in 10, 15, 20 years from now will be asking these questions, and then the next stage will be this species dominance debate. In other words, should human beings build Artilects or not? That question I see dominating our global politics this century. So then you can imagine people will take sides. Some people will say, building these super creatures, these godlike creatures, is almost a kind of religion. Not a traditional religion. And these beliefs, these ideas are based on science, modern science. So you can almost label it a kind of science-based new religion. So I've coined a couple of labels to label these human groups. The people who want to build these Artilects, a sort of god builder. So that group I label cosmists. That's based on the word cosmos, because that's their perspective. The big picture. We live in a universe with trillion stars. Our pathetic little human lives that get snuffed out in a mere 80 years in a universe that's billions of years old. That kind of thinking. So label them cosmists. So the ideology would be cosmism. Now the other group, I label them the Terrans. That's Terra, the Earth, because that's their perspective, much narrower. And the top priority for the Terrans, in other words, the people who are opposed to building these Artilects, their greatest motivation would be fear. Fear that perhaps one day, if these Artilects came into being, they may become so superior to human beings that they may consider us as nothing. I mean, by analogy, the way we walk around the carpet and we kill bacteria at every step, and we don't give a damn because they're bacteria and we're humans. We feel ourselves so superior to those bacteria, they're nothing to us. So it's an easy, obvious analogy that if these Artilects became literally trillions of times greater capacity than we have, then maybe they may feel the same about us and just not give a damn about us. I mean, maybe they'll either consciously try to exterminate us for whatever reason, maybe for reasons we don't even, we'd never understand because we're too stupid. We're just so humanly stupid compared to them. Or maybe just as a kind of side effect, they may decide to do something, for example, get rid of all the oxygen, and as a side effect, we get destroyed, and they're oblivious. They're just so superior to us. It'd be like us not caring about rocks or something, that kind of analogy. Then the species dominance debate heats up, and especially as that IQ gap between human level and robot level, machine intelligence level, as that gap closes, then the debate will rage. Because what's at stake here? On the one hand, the cosmists are arguing, well, this is a kind of God building. This is like the next major step in evolution. There's a whole universe out there. I mean, the big picture. And on the other hand, you've got the Terrans saying, well, the most important thing to human beings is our survival. And so in the limit, when push really comes to shove, if these cosmists are genuine about building these Artilects, then in the limit, the Terrans will be prepared to kill them. Right? They will argue that it's the lesser evil to wipe out a few million cosmists for the sake of the survival of billions of human beings. Right? So you have two very powerful, murderously opposed ideologies. And I see these two ideologies conflicting each other to the same extent, historically speaking, as what happened in the 19th and 20th centuries, when you had the communist and capitalist ideologies over the issue of who should own capital, who should own the factories and the machines, all that production. Should they be privately owned or owned by everybody, communally owned, or basically communism? And we almost destroyed ourselves in a potential World War III in 1962 in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Today, this species dominance issue, it sounds like science fiction. I mean, it's almost impossible for people to imagine some creature that would be like a trillion times above us in mental capacities, thinking a million times faster, like doing a PhD in minutes, this kind of thing. Virtually unlimited memory, unlimited senses. It could go anywhere, turn itself into whatever form it wanted, change its architecture in seconds. Just this godlike creature. So a lot of people will want to do that. Now, there's a third group, and you can call them the cyborgs or the cyborgists. They're the people who want to become Artilects themselves by simply adding components to their own brain and so forth. So bit by bit, deliberate pun, they become Artilects themselves. But very quickly, I mean, for example, there's more computing capacity in a grain of sugar, if you calculate it, compared to the human brain by, I don't know, billions, trillions, something like that. So very quickly, a cyborg, that's part machine, part human, a cyborg very quickly becomes an Artilect. And the proportion of its nature that's human is negligible, absolutely drowned and swamped by this vastly superior computational capacity of the technology. So I see the Terrans, they're the people who are opposed to the Artilects being built. I see the Terrans just simply lumping the cyborg guys, cyborgs, and the Artilects into the same camp. They will be bitterly opposed to them. Now, Ray Kurzweil, a famous guy, a futurist in America, he's criticized the scenario that I'm giving. He's saying, Hugo, and that's me, if it came to a war between the Terrans and the Artilects, or the Terrans and the Cosmists, then it would be sort of like a war between the US Army and the Amish. I don't know if your listeners know. For listeners who don't know who the Amish are, they're a religious sect in America, and part of their religion, ideology, whatever, is to not use any technology more recent than 19th century. So literally they ride around in horse and buggy, they don't use telephones or internet, that kind of thing. So that they live in the 19th century. So of course, as the Americans say, no contest, right? Okay, now, in a sense, I agree with what Ray Kurzweil is saying. If the Terrans do nothing, if they just sit around and wait. So if they just sit around waiting, then the Artilects come into being, the cyborgs come into being, and then it would be no contest, because the human beings would then be vastly superior. Okay, now with this logic, therefore, the Terrans will argue they have a time window of opportunity. They cannot wait too long. If they do, they're doomed. Or maybe. The risk then is there, because then the Artilects would exist, and then maybe they would like swat us like we swat mosquitoes. Maybe treat us as pests. Now, maybe not, but you're not going to take the risk, right? The risk is too great. You're talking about the potential extermination of billions of human beings. No politician is going to accept that risk. So the Terrans will be ruthless. If the cosmists are dead serious about going ahead and building these godlike creatures, these Artilects, then I see a war coming between the Terrans and the cosmists. And this ideological difference, this bitter, murderously dangerous confrontation, I believe will happen in the second half of this century, given the timing.
That was Hugo De Garis at the Singularity Summit in Melbourne, discussing whether we will build godlike, massively super-intelligent machines and what the possibility means for us all. He's hoping that the discussion of the possibility of an Artilect war doesn't become a self-fulfilling prophecy. You can hear part 3 in the coming weeks. And that's all from us, this time on Diffusion. You can send email to science@diffusionradio.com. That's science@diffusionradio.com. And tell us your thoughts, feelings and stories. Subscribe to our podcast on the Diffusion website, www.diffusionradio.com. That's www.diffusionradio.com. Contributing to the program was Lachlan Whatmore. I produced Diffusion. Diffusion is broadcast nationally via the Community Radio Network. Diffusion is syndicated globally on the National Science Foundation's Science 360 internet radio station and also on astronomy.fm. I'm Ian Woolf. Join us inside your audio device of choice for more science wondering next week on Diffusion Science Radio.
Science is fun. It helps you to learn, to know, and to appreciate. When you study science, you may go on field trips. You discover the marvelous interrelationships between all living things. You learn to read the history of the Earth as it is written in rocks and fossils. You find out what makes things tick, everything from a molecule to a living organism. In the study of science is found the most useful and satisfying knowledge of man. Knowledge of his physical world, its past, its present, and its future. And in your moments of relaxation, now and in the years to come, you will find the study of science leading you into fascinating pursuits. Photography, collecting. Why study science? Study science because you will find in the study of science a richer, more rewarding life.